Proviso is pretty much the MVP of every trading post around. More interestingly, she's actually in a rather unique position when it comes to expanding the teams of Kazimierz. Let me explain. First, let me preface this by saying what I like about ARKNIGHTS world building is it's able to slowly establish its various narratives and plot points through the nuanced points of view of its characters, because, well, it has such an expansive roster. Sure, the game does have its bunch of protagonists, exceptional business leaders, geniuses, and peerless warriors, which primarily drive the plot forward. But it also features relatively regular people, some even non-combatants, and their character files and individual stories are all valuable in setting the scene for not just Rhodes Island, but Terra as a whole. Proviso is one of these characters, a lawyer who got her time in the limelight along with Monar in the Kazimierz-based Ignat series and Obscure Wanderer. We already know from a meta perspective that the Kazimierz stories, the ones you see on the screen right now, are very much a criticism of capitalism and how it encroaches on human ideals, as they focus on the deterioration of knighthood and its commercialization in a stratified society where money is power and greed is king. This is a fact that even the Damazdi cluster notes from their time in Kazimierz. What's interesting about Proviso and her story is that of the playable Kazimierzian characters, he's the only one who's neither knight or knight adjacent, who's also been a major part of a focused storyline. This makes her a unique viewpoint character with regards to understanding Kazimierz ideals, as her domain is not in the battlefields and arenas, but rather its offices and courtrooms. And fittingly for a lawyer, much of her character's struggle revolved around grasping the notion of justice in capitalist Kazimierz. Now, let's actually have an analysis of Proviso as a character. Proviso used to be an idealistic sort, but in her time as an attorney, you could see her become someone who is rather jaded and resigned to the reality of her profession. This reality being one that has been shaped by the capitalist ethos of Kazimierz, its regard to justice shackling her from acting on her beliefs, as Kazimierz puts much value to winning, to victory, regardless of ethical cost. Proviso goes along with the underhanded methods her law firm enables her with. Her character's struggle is her being complicit to the system, while trying to do right for the wrongs that she enables. Ultimately, Proviso is a character that works as a lawyer to make a living and, following suit, to make amends. Her operational record, titled Hypothetically Just, is one of my favorites, much so because it's one of the game's best stories in terms of representing an operator's entire character arc and struggle. It's a story in which we see Proviso doing what is a rather innocuous job for her with an underhanded tactic at the ready. She succeeds and gets her client out cleanly. However, the methods she used elicits a response from the wife of the plaintiff. In actuality, this was a welcome scenario for Proviso, as she then takes advantage of the situation in order to unravel a deeper conspiracy. Not only then does she achieve a semblance of proper justice, she does so in a way that both helps her original objective as well as placates the plaintiff's wife. This OpRec is a display of just how Proviso had deteriorated. Interspersed between the proceedings are cut-ins featuring characterizing references to her graduation thesis. In particular, the featured excerpts paints Proviso in an idealistic light, and I quote, "But when the topic of justice is brought up, as well as when seeking any kind of deontological ethical foothold in Kazimierz's current legal system, we must consider the ever-encroaching, foundational influence that capitalism has on the values of the general public." However, the Proviso we see in the OpRec seems anything but someone who could have written that. Instead, we see a Proviso that's underhanded, arguably corrupt, and complicit. In-universe, her thesis was rejected for revisions, and she just complies. Unable to stand for herself, unable to enact any means of systemic change by herself, she falls in line to the status quo. She's proven the need for her thesis right, and she did so in the most tragic way possible, being an example of someone whose own values have been encroached on. Still, even aside from the OpRec, we also do see a Proviso who tries to do right by who she wronged. In her first case ever, where she was immediately introduced to the low nature of her work, she donated her earnings to the wife of a prisoner that she incriminated. In another case, after securing another win, she also leaked critical information to the opposing counsel so that they could properly contest the case later. She herself knows that what she does is a false justice, yet still she willingly participates in the charade of due process because, of course, it's her job. Perhaps one can say that a particular effect of the Kazimierzian capitalist ethos is an emphasis on the value of winning and profit. And to make a living, Proviso is forced to comply to the system. This, of course, leaves her ultimately cynical, as seen in her talk after promotion to line.
The courtroom is a place of victory and defeat. Both sides submit their evidence, and their disputes are arbitrated within the confines of the law. I never expected to find any justice in that process, but when the law can be freely trampled on by capitalism, being a lawyer gets real boring, don't you think?
It can actually be said that Proviso herself is a victim of this capitalist structure of Kazimierz. While Pinus Silvestris are one example of how Kazimierz values affects an oppressed class of people, Proviso's story is a glimpse of how it affects someone in the upper middle class, as she effectively feels forced to compromise on her ideals. It mustn't be understated though, Proviso is very much complicit to the status quo of Kazimierz. One way of interpreting Proviso's actions is that her attempts to redeem herself are a coping mechanism, a way to satisfy her ego and help keep herself moving forward. A more unforgiving interpretation, however, would be that she's the type to have her cake and eat it too. She enjoys the security of having a lucrative job, while being able to satisfy her own ego as she convinces herself that what she does to redeem herself would be sufficient penance, as if to justify her actions. It really puts into perspective the stylistic choice to title it hypothetically just. It essentially makes us ask the question, is there any justice in Proviso's actions? These pair of words, hypothetically just, essentially implies that there is justice in what she does, but there's something that puts doubt to this claim. It puts into perspective Proviso's position. She's a victim. She's also complicit. Both can be true. Nevertheless, she is not blind to her own nature and how what she enables is ultimately not a noble, proper justice. Rather, she actually has a rather realistic, albeit cynical way of looking at it. In one conversation, we see her tell Monar that she's not the type to right the world's wrongs, and what she's doing is just her job. In another conversation, well, it's better if we just read it aloud. No, I've never thought like that. A lawyer's job is to fight for their clients, no matter who they are. There's nothing I can say to that. Even if it's to help large corporations squeeze out innocent and helpless civilians, there's no justice in that, is there? Of course, there's truth to this statement. In real-life justice systems, the defense is generally entitled the right to counsel, who do their job not necessarily to defend their client from a guilty verdict, but rather to make sure any charges are properly examined and are appropriate within the context of the law. However, there is an interesting question here. How much of this attachment is Proviso saying this professionally? And how much of it is really just her convincing herself that the wrongs she commits isn't a reflection of her personally? Her promotional record file is very interesting and hilariously dark when taken out of context. But it does make sense with her character. In the text, she's not literally telling her client to kill their enemies, but rather that the law itself is not their own so-called protective talisman, and is actually something that keeps them in check, being the means to decide winners and losers rather than strength and violence. Of course, in character, she does gloat about her role in this. But, more importantly, playing within the rules of the courtroom, working around the limitations of the law in order to achieve a more proper justice, is something that we've also seen her do in both of her stories. We can only imagine that these are the means she's taking after what happened in her first case, in order to make sure that such a tragedy will never happen again. Sure, it's not an ideal situation, not an ideal justice, but in the circumstances that Kazimierz has been dealing her, this small, roundabout justice is good enough. The climax of her character arc, the moment she saw the stars, is perhaps the moment where she ultimately realized that something needed to change. Fresh from a conversation with Monar after she secured a deal that will displace an entire village, she finally starts questioning herself. Call it a renewed sense of idealism or sentimentality, or perhaps the guilt finally caught up. But this was essentially the one moment where she decided she was done. She wanted out. She finally saw the stars, literally and figuratively. She said it herself. No one can see the stars above until all the neon lights are turned off. The stars here being a metaphor for justice and ideals, and neon lights, of course, being Kazimierz. In its brightest cities, the skyline is so polluted by this artificial light that the stars can't be seen, her ideals devoured by Kazimierz. It is only after the events of the Kazimierz Major that she finally saw the stars again, gaining an interest in RI after their actions in the Major and inspired to live her life anew. The rest, of course, is history. In the grand scheme of things, Proviso is a one-off character that likely won't get any significant screen time after her event. Nevertheless, as much as the Kazimierz stories are ones of searching a lost chivalry and, quite literally, lost persons, it's also pretty much also the game's strongest commentary on capitalism, and the conceptualization of Proviso, the character, as a way to expand on this further, is certainly not lost on us. There are very much parallels to be drawn between Kazimierzian knighthood and its justice system. Both have been commercialized to a degree that they can both be described as a farce. While the stories of Kazimierz will likely follow through on the plot of Nerl's missing parents, I do commend that HG are still willing to build their world gradually through stories and perspectives such as Proviso's. If you got to this point and watched the entire thing, well, thanks for watching. I know it's an ARKNIGHTS lore video pretty much out of nowhere, but I do like having an occasional video essay style vid on lore here. I even have a draft of one related to character stories, so if you like these types of vids, make sure to like and sub too maybe, so I can tell if there's an audience for it. Anyway, that's all. Deuces.